Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We are gonna go ahead. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Naomi Klein. I'm the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies. The chair is a collaboration between the School of Communication and Information, the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and the Institute for Women's Leadership. And I'm very pleased to see that Mary Trigg, the chair of WGS, is here, and I also want to acknowledge Lisa Hetfield, the interim director of the Institute for Women's Leadership. Inspired by Gloria Steinem's heterodox life, the chair is about making connections and crossing boundaries between sectors and disciplines and movements. There's really no subject that embodies the need for that kind of fearless boundary crossing than our responses to the intersectional crisis of climate change. My latest book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, as you can see by the subtitle, makes the case that we urgently need a transformational approach to the climate crisis. And that is what we're going to be digging into tonight, what that transformation would really look like. This is the first in a series of events that I'll be hosting as the chair's flagship project this academic year. There's going to be 3 public panel discussions about the Green New Deal, followed by movement meetings. And in each one, we're going to be tackling a different aspect of the transformation ahead. Before I dig in, I'd like to thank Kylie Davidson, Program Coordinator for the Steinem Chair. Kylie, as always, has done a wonderful job planning and stewarding this event, so thank you so much, Kylie. Yay! I also want to thank the wonderful ITV crew who we've been working with all day, doing interviews with our amazing panelists, and they are also filming the event tonight. And I want to thank my co-conspirators at the LEAP, particularly Rajiv Sakura and Avi Lewis, who are here in the front row, who have helped put this on. The LEAP is an organization that we co-founded a few years ago to map science and justice-based responses to the climate crisis. And if you'd like to learn more about our work, you can go to theleap.org. Much of the work of the LEAP is about supporting the now global push for a Green New Deal, a vision for how the climate crisis can be a catalyst to create huge numbers of unionized, good, well-paying jobs, and to battle racial and gender injustice at the same time. The Green New Deal is not a brand new idea. It has its roots in the environmental justice movements of the Global South and also in frontline communities of color in the United States. It used to be systematically ignored by the entire political class, but that started to change about a year ago when a scrappy group of organizers from the Sunrise Movement decided to occupy the office of Nancy Pelosi after the Democrats won the midterm elections and took back the House. And they had a very clear demand, and that was for a Green New Deal. And they were supported and visited by newly elected insurgent new congresswomen like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, who had run on platforms promising to introduce a Green New Deal. Soon thereafter, we saw the resolution that was co-authored by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, which laid out a policy framework for what they called a moonshot approach to decarbonization, attempting to reach net zero emissions in just 1 decade. As part of this sweeping transition, the Green New Deal calls for huge investments in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in clean public transportation, and affordable housing. It states that workers moving from high carbon sectors to green ones should have their wage levels protected and their benefits protected, and it guarantees a job to all who want to work. It also calls for the communities who have borne the toxic burden of our addiction to fossil fuels, so many of them Indigenous, Black, and Brown, to not only benefit from transitions, but to democratically help to design them. It is a big, bold vision, and it is drawn in the resolution in very broad strokes. It has since been endorsed by the majority of the candidates leading the pack to run against Donald Trump in the next election. Each of them have added their own specifics to what a Green New Deal would mean. Some of them have raised the bar, some have lowered it. With this event series at Rutgers, we're going to be zeroing in on some key parts of the Green New Deal discussion that we feel are not being talked about nearly enough and which are systematically under-theorized by emission reduction specialists. Not surprisingly, several of these gaps in our collective discussion involve the labor and knowledge of women, the labor and knowledge of immigrants, and the labor and knowledge of Indigenous peoples. Our focus this evening is on care work, a sector dominated by women, often immigrant women. And this is a sector, much of which was excluded from the original New Deal. Domestic workers were not covered included in many of the New Deal programs. So it's a very good thing that care work is not excluded in the AOC Markey resolution. Their plan calls for major new investments to ensure that healthcare, childcare, and education are truly universal and accessible to all. But judging from the debates that the Green New Deal has sparked, it's clear that a great many people, including very influential people with big platforms in the media, don't really understand why care work is included in this climate plan. We often hear that the Green New Deal is just a lefty grab bag, a lefty wish list, all of these unconnected issues. What is Medicare for All doing in there? What is childcare doing in there? We hear these critiques all the time. And there are a clear indication of how much intellectual work there is to do in linking the labor of care, teaching, nursing, childcare, elder care, disability support, mental health support, with the lived reality of climate disruption, as well as with the kind of economy that stands a chance of lowering emissions in line with science. So before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I'm just going to do a very, very quick overview about some of these intersections. The most obvious, and many of you have heard me talk about this before, has to do with the title, that care work is climate work. Now, the most obvious reason for this is that a lot of the work in the care economy is already low carbon work and can be made even more so. It doesn't burn a lot of carbon to care for one another, to care for the sick, to care for children and the elderly. And we can invest in making these better jobs. But care work is climate work also because care workers are already on the front lines of the climate crisis. Just last week, as part of my book tour, I was in Northern California and visited some of the places that were recently devastated by historic wildfires, disasters that climate scientists have linked to a warmer, drier climate. I visited Paradise, California. This is from the historic fire, the largest fire in the state's history, that happened just under a year ago, the Camp Fire, it was called, and it killed 85 people, now 86, as there's been another death in hospital, and destroyed over 14,000 homes. This is what was left of Paradise's elementary school after the Camp Fire. I met with researchers at Cal State, and I talked to many people about the experience of living through these fires, and many of them remarked on the fact that nurses and home care workers instantly became first responders, performing incredible feats of heroism to save their patients and clients. This is part of the Paradise evacuation. These are workers who risk their lives to save people in their care, even as their own homes burned. One labor and delivery nurse, Tamara Ferguson, has talked about getting elderly patients, babies, a new mother who had just had a C-section out of the hospital as it went up in flames. She puts her sense of duty like this: we need to save our patients and ourselves. If we were going to die today, we would at least do it protecting others and do everything we can to live, and we did. So here's some other examples of care workers on the front lines. These are some Bay Area nurses evacuating a patient during the 2017 fires. Teachers, principals, and bus drivers are often having to make these wrenching, snap decisions to drive their students to safety when they have no idea how they will reunite them with their parents. What we know about disasters is that they intensify pre-existing vulnerabilities, which means that the people who are most impacted tend to be disabled, elderly, sick, most in need of care workers in order to get to safety. And just as we see it during fires, we also see it during storms. This was an image that many of you may remember from Hurricane Harvey. It's an image of the La Vida Bella nursing home in Dickinson, Texas during Hurricane Harvey. The nursing home workers were so desperate that they posted this image as a call for help, and it went viral, and a rescue team did arrive soon after. Schools, hospitals, nursing homes, again and again, they have been in the teeth of various climate disasters. And what we're learning again and again is that care workers save lives. Given that we are going to see more and more large-scale disasters, we need to invest in these sectors so that they can cope with the increased demands, because what we know is that no matter what we do to lower emissions, we are going to be facing more disasters, and they are going to intensify, because the best that we can do is keep warming below levels of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And these kinds of disasters that we're seeing, we've warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius, so it is going to get worse. And rather than investing in these sectors that are so on the front lines, the opposite is happening. Care workers are undervalued, they're underpaid. Public schools, hospitals, and long-term care facilities that serve the most vulnerable people in the country are systematically neglected. And then, under what I've called the shock doctrine, the infrastructure of care often faces further attacks in the immediate aftermath of disasters. Public hospitals are closed, public schools are shuttered and often privatized. In some, disasters are harnessed to advance a more unequal society that will leave more people behind when the next shock comes. I first saw this in play when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans a decade and a half ago. And I saw it again a little more than 2 years ago when Hurricane Maria pummeled Puerto Rico. An estimated 3,000 people died in the aftermath of that disaster, but it wasn't from falling debris and high winds. It was because of a collapsed healthcare system and electricity system that could not begin to deal with the need. People died because they weren't able to plug in their oxygen machines, their dialysis machines. This is the Vieques Hospital today. It's the only hospital on the island, and it is still closed, forcing gravely sick people to have to wait in lines and take ferries in order to get life-saving treatment. The New York Times recently toured abandoned schools in Puerto Rico. Around 300 schools have not been reopened since Hurricane Maria, and there's been a major push to reopen charter schools. This is more from that series. I've been talking about some of the most dramatic US disasters in recent years, but of course the reality of climate disruption is, for the most part, much less dramatic, much slower moving, grinding. For example, with wildfire season months longer than it was just a few decades ago, students in the Pacific Northwest, even when they're not on the front lines of fires, are having to deal with the reality of having months of the year just choked in smoke, which is aggravating all kinds of respiratory illnesses. That's Oakland 2 summers ago. And this caused over 180 California school districts to send more than 1 million students home last November. And it's not just the biggest disasters, it's also the slower burn of extreme heat as the thermostat continuously creeps up. We all know the weather that we're experiencing is not what we should be experiencing in October, and the infrastructure that we have, including our educational infrastructure, is not built for this kind of heat. So many of the schools where our kids are going aren't built to naturally circulate air, and they also don't have air conditioning. So this is happening here in New Jersey, where students in multiple school districts were sent home early. This is Fort Lee High. Students were sent home in the middle of a recent heat wave. The data isn't totally solid because this is under-researched, but something like 30% of schools lack air conditioning in this country. In Philadelphia, only about 25% actually have it, which might be fine, like I said, if they were built to naturally circulate air, but they aren't. And the problem, of course, is most acute in poor areas, which are overwhelmingly communities of color. Research shows that students have trouble learning when they're exposed to rising temperatures. Their test scores suffer, again, with unequal impacts. In fact, climate impacts are just one more knock against students who are already struggling with biased testing systems and structural racism in education. And of course, these crises are intersecting. A shocking number of schools in this country, as we know, have dangerous levels of lead in the drinking water, including in Newark, New Jersey. So think about that in the context of the fact that these schools are also overheating. So students are having to choose between drinking water that is unsafe and facing dehydration. This is what climate change is looking like in our school system without an extreme disaster. These are some of the physical impacts, but of course, we are also seeing all kinds of health impacts, and Nella is going to talk about this as well, ways in which climate disruption is intensifying all kinds of health risks, and also mental health risks. We're seeing these communities that are hit by these large-scale disasters. A report from the American Psychological Association recently talks about climate change bringing a whole spate of acute effects, and this is a quote, like trauma, shock, PTSD, compounded stress, anxiety, substance abuse, and depression, as well as intensifying various chronic illnesses and depression. And we, of course, don't have the infrastructure to deal with this. This requires more care workers, and we don't have them. We saw this really dramatically in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Some of you may remember the story of a suicide hotline, a 24-hour mental health hotline, which was absolutely overwhelmed with callers. According to a government report, more than 3,000 people who called the line between November 2017 and January 2018 reported having already attempted suicide, a 246% increase from the previous year. So care work is climate work, whether it is recognized or not. Care workers are already on the front lines of this crisis. But there is some good news. The good news is that care workers know how to face these challenges. They know how to care for the most vulnerable, the youngest, the oldest, the most disabled and ill, because that is what they are trained to do. They also have exciting ideas about how to green their own sectors so that they can lead to a new economy, one based on caring for the earth and for each other. So that's more than enough for me, and I'm very excited to introduce you to these amazing panelists. I'll start to my right, Emily Comer. Well, Emily Comer is a legend. She is a teacher and an organizer in South Charleston, West Virginia, and a member of AFT and West Virginia United Caucus. She was recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people for her efforts leading up to the 2018 teacher strike in West Virginia. That strike made history. It inspired teachers across this country to believe that they too could organize and demand better working conditions. It sparked a wave of other strikes, including in red states, including in states where organizing strikes is very, very hard. Next to Emily is Aquilina Soriana Versosa. She is founder and executive director of the Filipino Worker Center in Southern California, a nonprofit serving and organizing the low-wage Filipino worker community in Los Angeles. Aquilina, who we're instructed to call her Aki, is also the current president of the board of directors of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, co-chair of the Filipino Voter Empowerment Project, and has been chosen as one of the Frederick Douglass 200 abolitionists, which is where we first met. And next to Aki, yes. Next to Aki is my friend Dara Baldwin, who is a leader in the field of disability rights. She heads up the legislative work of the Center for Disability Rights, where she is Director of National Policy. CDR is a nonprofit, community-based advocacy and service organization for people with all types of disabilities. And she has been very vocal in pointing out that people with disabilities are among the most vulnerable to climate disruption. And this has been a big hole in the way we have talked about the social impacts of the climate crisis. So thank you so much, Dara, for your work and being here. And finally, Nela Pineda-Marcon works as a clinical nurse at the Mount Sinai St. Luke's Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Department in New York. She has been a proud union member of the New York State Nurses Association for over 25 years. And Nela currently serves on the board of directors and is the chair of their Climate Justice and Disaster Relief Committee and is very much on the front line. So Nela, thank you so much for being here. All right, so I'm going to move over here.
You have to press the face. The face. No, they want.
The thing. Thank you. I want to start with you, Emily. Now, you organized this historic strike in a region that, in addition to being on the front lines of climate disruption, and you've faced these huge floods, and I want you to talk about that and how that has impacted your students and schools. You are also in this part of the country that is on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction. You're from coal country and gas country, and what does that mean for your community in terms of the stresses that you're dealing with on a daily basis, including the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think it means that West Virginia is very much a sacrifice zone and like you said, a frontline community. And I think that any Green New Deal that's worth its name has to address the havoc that the fossil fuel industry has wreaked on the people of West Virginia for generations. We used to have, at its height in 1948, the coal industry employed around 132,000 miners. That number has dropped to about 13,000 today. So now West Virginia is one of only 2 states with a declining population. You look around and you just see hopelessness because the fossil fuel industry has, lobbied against any meaningful transition away from itself. So it's automated all of these jobs. It's decimated entire communities that were once thriving communities built on coal, and then it blasted the tops off of these mountains and poisoned the water with the coal runoff for the people who were left in these places. And again, people are left with just a sense of despair. We're now seeing this awful addiction crisis, and that is showing up in our schools. Teachers are seeing this day in and day out. So many students are living with their grandparents because they have a parent who is addicted to opioids. 25% of children in West Virginia live below the federal poverty line. I think 2/3 of our students qualify for free or reduced lunch. I think West Virginia has the lowest median income, right? So we have all of these factors that are directly linked to the fossil fuel industry. And our kids are experiencing trauma.
And so what does it look like when climate disruption is layered on top of all of that?
Yeah, so our kids are vulnerable anyway. Even without the climate crisis, our kids would be vulnerable. But then when you have a flood, like this major flood that we saw in 2016, which was one of the worst floods we've ever seen. Those vulnerabilities are just exacerbated, right? In this flood, 23 people died. You had thousands of homes that were destroyed or severely damaged. You had a school in my county that was totally destroyed and still hasn't been rebuilt. They haven't begun construction on it. So it's now these students, over 700 students have just entered their 4th year of school. So that means the, freshmen, the kids who are the incoming freshman class, the class of 2020 who's about to graduate, their entire high school careers will have been spent in trailers without a school building. I just can't even imagine that. And this is a poor community. This is a poor school. I think you just can't really imagine 3 years later the construction on a school not beginning in a community that had money.
And so you went out on this historic strike, which I guess is an indication that you're not getting the resources that you need to deal with all of these additional stresses. Can you talk a little bit about that from the teacher's perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, for years, the public education budget has been strapped. We're teaching in these crowded classrooms. Now with, like you mentioned, with HVAC systems that are failing. I know that's true in my school. It's true across the state, really. You're having missed instructional days because of extreme heat. And yeah, I mean, that's very much a factor. But I think that this strike was, I think something a lot of people don't realize about this strike was that our primary demand was not a coal severance tax, but a gas severance tax. Mm-hmm. So teachers were flooding the Capitol chanting, "Tax our gas." And of course, that was not, an explicit environmental demand or climate demand. It was not at all that kind of message, but there was sort of this realization that the fossil fuel industry has been taking and taking and taking from us, and that they owed us, our fair share.
Thank you. Yeah. So Aki, I would, when we were talking earlier, you described the workers that you represent in Los Angeles, who are Filipino home care workers, overwhelmingly working with an older population, doing elder care. That you're sort of at the that you're working with two vulnerable communities, right? The workers and the people they're caring for, and they're both vulnerable. Can you paint a picture of what that looks like in the context of the sorts of fires that I was talking about and other climate stresses in California?
And then turn yours. There you go. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Sure. So, what we've seen is home care workers who are caring for elders in their homes. These are really two vulnerable populations, right? Home care workers are overwhelmingly women and women of color. They're very low-paid jobs. Many times immigrants in California, and then there's the elders that they're caring for. And when disasters happen, we saw this in California with the wildfires. Caregivers and domestic workers were first responders. And in 2018, Theresa Santos was a home care worker who refused to leave her client who was not able to be moved, and they both perished in the fire. She didn't save herself. And there's another Filipino caregiver who was with his family in a small care home, and his family helped to get everyone out, but there was one client who was non-ambulatory and had different complications, so he stayed behind to make sure that he could rig up something to actually get him out of the home, and he was pushing him down the street as the fire was like on their heels. And they fortunately made it out. But after the fires, there was no more jobs for these care workers. So the elders were then transferred to other places, but the care workers and the domestic workers, frankly, because all of the homes burned, had no jobs. And because so many of them were undocumented workers, so many people in that community relied on these undocumented workers to provide that care. The workers couldn't access the same amount of relief and relief funds as other people in the community. So it really left them in a very hard place. So care workers are also first responders actually anytime, medical emergencies. A lot of people don't understand and think that sometimes care work could be just, oh, you're just sitting around and, it's not really hard work. But they don't understand how heavy the work is, the responsibility of caring for someone, especially who has dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and that you're doing it in a way that you want them to have a quality life. A lot of the care workers that I work with also have been impacted by the climate disasters overseas. So Philippines has been hit, is a Pacific island, and has been hit again and again by typhoons. Super Typhoon Haiyan hit in 2017, and we had members who lost family members, and it's actually these care workers are the ones who are going to be rebuilding those communities for the long term. It's the relief, the international relief can come in briefly, but usually it's just for a moment. It's actually the overseas workers who are continually putting money back in and rebuilding the communities. So they're actually impacted on very, very many different levels with climate change.
Thank you. So, Dara, you have been pointing out that the disability community is far too often left out of our discussion about the particular vulnerabilities of the climate crisis. And can you just sort of paint a picture of the sort of layers of vulnerability? There are many different ways. I guess I pointed at some of the most obvious, that people are left in their homes. But tell us more about what disabled people are facing in the context of intensifying climate disruption.
Sure, Naomi. First, thank you for having me here. Thank you, Rutgers. Go RU. I am a Rutgers graduate. Empower to the people. I'm right there with you, Emily. I'm also a member of ADAPT. We took over Mitch McConnell's office over the ACA, right? Fighting our lives. That's right. Over healthcare and how important that is. And I cannot be up here. I am from DC statehood. I cannot not say that. I'm so sorry. DC statehood, please tell your representatives it is you who's going to get us there. But to answer your question, Naomi, so people think of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as only a law around ramps and doorways and accessibility for people with disabilities. That is very true, but it is a civil right. And within that civil right, the premise of the ADA is community integration. If you know the history of this country, you had a disability, they put you in an institution. So for our community, it is keeping people out of those institutions. That is imperative to us. And in this conversation, what happens is you have pre, during, and post of these events. And what does not happen is the training of communities to understand and know what care workers do. When you shut down a city, right, and say, there will be no transportation from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. because we're fixing such and such and such, that care worker can't get to our person who's on a ventilator, who, right, could possibly die because they've been on a ventilator too long. So these things affect our community. So we see that when you're training, we see that city councils, and usually it's local, right? Local, right? All politics is local. I worked for a mayor's office, Mayor Gray in DC, and we had these issues. Emergency management planning does not include people with disabilities. When you have an event like this and you're gonna train a community, a room full of people, they usually have it in a place that's not accessible. They don't have an ASL interpreter. They don't have information in the communication that is for them, whether it be Braille, large print, or common language, like 4th grade level for language. So we see that. During the situations, we have seen, unfortunately, and you can go to the National Council on Disabilities new report that was out in May, as I said, institutionalizing. They want to put our people in institutions, that is against their civil right. They have the right to live in the community, and you as a community need to figure out how to save their life like you save the next person's. And if we work as a community, that will happen. What we see during storms, we see shelters that are not accessible. Our people can't get inside if they have a wheelchair or walker. They can't use the beds. We've seen people who have service animals turned away. And this is the American Red Cross, and I know I'm on TV and they know us, so whatever. They know they're doing wrong, and they should stop doing that. And we have had issues with the American Red Cross for years over this, and people who run shelters. The fires that were there, we have, unfortunately, people who are living in homes who still need repair. Right? So if, a community's not doing what they're supposed to do around accessible and affordable housing, we have our AA. The accessible is just as important, probably even more so now with people aging in place, as the affordable. And so therefore, people can't get out. The gentleman had to rig something up, right, to get his person out and put his life on the line. And then post, we have unfortunately seen the mayor in Miami-Dade County chose to do this, commit homeless people because they wouldn't go to safety. You cannot commit people because they won't go to safety, because they don't look like me and you and live like me and you. If I live in a townhouse, the sheriff comes and says, you gotta get out. I say, no, I'm gonna try to wait it out. He walks away, he rides away, good luck. The homeless person says, no, you're gonna commit them. You cannot do that. If they have the choice, just like you and I, that's their civil right. So we see this trend of committing people, and I think that comes from people not understanding, as I started at the beginning, the 88 is about community integration. That means that no matter what you look like or what your disability is, you have the right to live in the community and live independently. People don't know this, but in San Francisco started this in 1865, the ugly laws. Ugly laws were if you had a disability and you could not be on the street, they considered you ugly. Ugly laws, and that premise and how that, that is still there, like systemic racism, these things, you have a systemic cause and a systemic care towards people with disabilities that they're not needed, that they're ugly. And so when you have that as your foundation and basis of most of what you're doing around people with disabilities, you have the outcomes that we see every single day. So until we change that system of thought, that this community is not ugly, they are beautiful. They are living their lives just like me and you. They are mothers, they are parents, they are friends, they are workers. And they deserve to have the same emergency management and rescue as everyone else, and they deserve a voice in this conversation around climate change.
Thank you. We've also, we also see some amazing community response and solidarity in the context of climate disasters, and the tightest knit communities, people where they know the neighbor and they know where there's an elderly woman living on her own, or they know there's somebody in a wheelchair, and when you have that kind of tight knit community where people are watching out for each other, they save each other during disasters, and it's really isolation and neglect and treating people like they're disposable, that costs lives. Nella, I know that you had a transformative experience during Typhoon Haiyan, when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines in 2013, and I wonder if you would share that story and also what you learned from it.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so I've been a nurse in New York for 30 years and a member of the New York State Nurses Association. When Typhoon Haiyan happened, me and my husband were watching TV and we could not believe what's going on. And I just said, if somebody will ask me to go there right now, I'm gonna go. And my husband was like, what? It's Thanksgiving next week. So, and all of a sudden I had a phone call, Nella, would you like to join us? And it's like, sure. I didn't even ask anybody, but I went in there. I was very excited to see what's really going on. And I thought it's just one of those typhoons. When I walked in that place, it was very painful. You smell the stench of death. You see people walking in the area, no clothes, nothing. And I lost my group. And I also experienced that because there was no method of communication. There was nowhere to sleep. And we ended up sleeping on a ditch with the cardboard boxes. Straight from my flight in New York. And that was very painful. And I just prayed and I said, I'm here for a reason. I had my backpack full of stuff, like things that I could use. And so I went door to door in those houses. They're not really houses because they're gone. People were just there, like sitting there, like nowhere to eat or no bathrooms, nothing. So there's this man that was rebuilding his house, and he would not even talk to me. And I figured, like this is a big PTSD kind of guy. He lost his whole family. And I saw all the wounds in his body, like open, gaping wounds. And I said, could you just stop there and let me just suture your wounds? And I did that, and I was talking to him, and he said he lost his whole entire family. And it's just sad and very devastating on my part. And it impacted me a lot, and it made me very humble. It humbled me, and it made me thank for all whatever I have. As I was so blessed compared to all these people. I came back and reported what I've saw and what I've done, and my union started on the New York Relief Network, which actually got official after Maria. We had our membership. We have a lot of members that volunteered to missions, medical missions all over the world. And we work collaboratively with doctors in the area, as well as doctors who volunteer from New York. So we also have not just nurses, but doctors and pulmonary therapists, physical therapists that help us. And when we went to Guatemala, we were being helped by Cuban doctors, which was really a privilege. And that's what we do. We actually get our nurses involved in this missionary work that we do. And so far, we have a lot of members that are really involved in this, and we're very happy, and it's an ongoing thing. Thank you.
Thank you. When you're seeing those images of nurses saving the lives of the people in their care in the middle of wildfires, in the middle of storms, their houses may have just burned down, their houses may be flooding. Give us some insight as to why nurses do these incredible things, because you aren't recognized as first responders.
Yeah, as nurses in the front line, we care for front-end patient care. We see firsthand every day the destruction of climate change and climate justice issues have on the health of our patients. We nurses are healers. We have a duty to serve the public, and I think it's just in us that we help whoever is in need. And so it is our job to care for patients in their time of needs, but running in between disaster areas and helping victims of climate change is not a prescription for a healthy planet. We have to do more, and we have to be actively proactive in the climate justice, and use our profession as one of the most respected profession, use that to be voices for the people and for our patients in the community.
Thank you. So then that's a great place for us to pivot, because this is frightening. And we know we are entering into a future that is going to have more of these shocks. But we also are at a moment when, for the first time, we're talking about responses to the climate crisis that are on the scale of the crisis itself. We have, presidential candidates talking about marshaling trillions of dollars for the first time, including responses to the climate crisis that talk about spending real resources for climate justice between countries, and recognizing that a country like the Philippines is on the front lines of the impacts, but did very little to create the crisis. And so that has to reflect what we're seeing in terms of spending in the United States. So we can't have climate justice that stops at our borders. But care work has not really been centered in the discussion around the Green New Deal, and that was one of the things we really wanted to do with this event was get specific about what it would mean to have a Green New Deal in the care sector, what it would mean for the areas where all of you work to have the resources to meet these challenges and also transform in the face of the crisis. And I think that that's what's really exciting about the moment that we're in, is that we do have the possibility to not just imagine a future that isn't a climate apocalypse, but is also actually better than, in many ways, than the present that you are describing right now, because it would bring resources and invest in the sectors that tangibly improve people's lives. We know that when we invest in the care professions and when we invest in caring for each other and building stronger communities, it actually increases quality of life, right? More than just giving people more opportunities to go shopping. So let's talk about what this could mean. And once again, Emily, I want to start with you, and then we'll go down. I want you to paint a picture of what a real Green New Deal could mean, in West Virginia and in your schools. What would it mean for transportation? What would it mean for class size? What would it mean in the day-to-day?
Yeah, I think there are several ways to approach it. First of all, I think if we're going to implement a massive Green New Deal, it's going to mean a total overhaul of education, right? Because we're going to need a highly educated workforce who has the tools, to build a green infrastructure. And so teachers are going to be responsible for giving students those skills, right? So that's one piece of it. And of course, we're gonna need electric school buses, and we need to make sure that our school buildings are running on renewables and they're energy efficient. And so we need to retrofit our buildings, and that's a huge piece of it. And of course, that's a great opportunity because we have, our schools are, the infrastructure is failing in our schools. Our kids right now are sitting in hot classrooms, and like I mentioned, there are all these school cancellations, or not. They're just sitting there and fanning themselves. But I think that when we talk about the transition, sometimes we talk about infrastructure a lot, and we don't talk about all the rest of it. I think that we have this opportunity with the Green New Deal to talk about greening our economy by putting people's needs at the forefront of our society. And, part of that is repairing the harm that the fossil fuel industry has done in West Virginia. And, I'll give you an example. Like you mentioned class size. I can't begin to tell you what I can do in my classroom with a class of 15 students versus a class of 29 students, or even a class of 35 students, which some teachers have, I make it a point to build real relationships with my students. So when I tell them to turn in a paper, or, tell them they have a test coming up, they know that it's coming from someone who cares about them, right? And you just, if your class is packed, right, and you have this full class load, you can't do that the way you're supposed to do it, or the way that you want to do it. And I just think about what it would do for our entire society if every single student in the United States had a teacher who wasn't maxed out, right? Who had the time to call home often, who, was intimately familiar with the dreams and goals of their students and could work to fulfill them, right? Or foster them. So I think that's a huge piece of it. But there's also, the fact that we have a shortage of counselors in our building. Our counselors are basically doing nothing but scheduling. They don't have any time. They just make the schedule, right? So when a kid, again, our kids are experiencing trauma, and when they go to see the counselor, they have to wait, sometimes, days. That's a huge piece of it. I think even health clinics, right? It's the same thing with nurses. We have part-time nurses in our schools. So sometimes when a kid needs to go see the nurse isn't even in the building. So, right? Having full-time nurses in schools, but even health clinics. A friend of mine who teaches just a couple miles away from me told me that they've recently put in a health clinic at his school, which is great. The teachers love it, the kids love it. He teaches in a really, really poor community, and these kids, desperately need this access to healthcare, right? But the only thing is, not all of them have health insurance, and they have to have health insurance on file. So I think that goes to show, you mentioned people are questioning, why is Medicare for all part of this? It has to be. It has to be.
Yes.
So
What you're saying about class size reminds me, when I was in Puerto Rico, after Maria, I interviewed the head of one of the teachers' unions there, Mercedes Martinez, and they were facing these hundreds of schools being closed, and the rationale was, well, look at all the people who are leaving Puerto Rico, because of course our entire infrastructure failed, so hundreds of thousands of people are leaving, so we have to close the schools. And Mercedes was saying, how about just having smaller class size? Like, it's not a problem. We would be much happier. Our classes are way too big, and we have huge numbers of special needs kids in Puerto Rico. Why don't you let us do our jobs, because we weren't able to do it before. And that was an opportunity, really. And it was, instead, it was just totally squandered, and the schools were shut down.
yeah, we're seeing the exact same thing in West Virginia. That sounds so familiar. Yep.
And also, the mental health crisis. I just, to share another example, when I was in Chico and talking to, talking to some of the faculty who are dealing with students with PTSD. The truth is, kids are going to be living with loss in this future, right? We are going to be dealing with the reality of living on a planet in the midst of a great extinction. They are going to be dealing with the loss of beloved places, and and trauma is going to be part of life, and we have to invest in helping people deal with that. So, I think what you said about counselors, it's not a luxury, right? And, I think it is so important that we talk so much about infrastructure and we don't talk about what it actually means to live together without turning on each other and ourselves, right? Because we're seeing that more and more, that in communities after disasters, we see hikes in suicide, domestic violence, other forms of violence. So people are turning on each other and they're turning on themselves. And if that's not going to happen, we need tools, right? Mm-hmm. So, Aki, I want to talk to you about these two vulnerable communities again, right? And these two communities that in some sense are both treated as disposable within our culture. The workers and the people that they care for. So in a future, in your ideal Green New Deal future, what would it look like to cherish both of those communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we just think of the New Deal wasn't just a couple projects, right? It was about how we're transforming society, right? So this Green New Deal has to be about how we're transforming society, not just to survive the climate issue, but how we're actually going to thrive as a community, actually have a promise of good lives, right? And so with caregivers, so right now we're in the midst of a demographic shift, right? So baby boomers have been coming into retirement years. Every 8 seconds, someone turns 65 in this country. So there's this huge growth in seniors in this country, which means there's this huge, both this huge opportunity, because people are living longer as well as the baby boomers coming into retirement. So we have this huge opportunity to have our elders with us for longer. But then we also have this huge need for care, and we have this huge challenge to meet this need so that it doesn't turn into more of a crisis, right? To actually have long-term care benefits where people can actually age and in their own homes and in their own communities, instead of being institutionalized, right, and isolated. So in this future, what I see is I really see that, first of all, the accessibility is absolutely necessary to good quality care, that everyone deserves it. Right now, it's only if you can pay for it that you actually get this kind of care. Medicare does not pay for long-term care, right? A lot of people don't know that. And so many people are in crisis right now. So many people feel it so personally, this crisis of what they're going to do, either with their family members or for themselves. So caregivers can actually, so we need accessibility. So in California, we are working on, and as part of Caring Across Generations, we're looking at universal family care. How do we, as a whole society, support universal family care, both for our children as well as our elders, people with disabilities? Everyone gets accessibility to good quality home care and the options that they choose that are best for them, right? And at the same time, these jobs have to be good jobs, right? Caregiving jobs are low carbon jobs, right? They are not extracting, they are not polluting, but it's actually a very necessary basic infrastructure that our country needs. And actually countries around the world actually are going through this as well and need a strong care infrastructure. So like the New Deal invested in transportation, in all of these big works, that laid a foundation for our society to actually be successful, we need to also invest in this care infrastructure so that our communities and our communities can thrive, they can be productive and be in the workforce, and that we can actually benefit from all of the generational experience and all that actually we can benefit when we have our communities whole and together. And it's like you said, it's breaking through that isolation, but building really integrated communities. Caregivers who work in homes and domestic workers, family caregivers, are actually a basic infrastructure that we have existing in our communities right now, that if they were organized, could actually be a really powerful organized first responder force, right? Just as you said, if you knew everyone in your community, you knew who were the people who were vulnerable, and you were able to plan accessibility of like have a real plan of what everyone needs to actually to survive and to be protected, and to, that as a community then with caregivers at the forefront of actually organizing and leading this effort, then that's actually an infrastructure that we could already put into place.
And I just have a quick follow-up because I know you have put some thought into how this work can be made even lower carbon, how it can be greener. What would it take?
Well, one would be transportation, because a lot of caregivers need to travel to remote places or on a daily basis. So if we have accessible, low-cost or free green transportation, that would make their jobs even and accessible, free transportation with all the accessibility necessary. That's right. That would also make the jobs more low carbon. And also caregivers can be a big resource because they're the ones who do shopping actually for the household a lot of times, who purchase the cleaning products and do the cleaning of the house. So all of those things could be greened also. They also a lot of times are care managers, where they help families to navigate what they're going through with their elders, but also they can connect them to resources, right? So they can connect them to resources like installing solar panels or things like that, even planting vegetable gardens and helping to build that kind of local effort around food. And if caregivers are actually paid not just a decent wage, but like a good wage, and that's actually what we need to shift the economy to. This is caregiving is the fastest growing job in the United States, right? But there's a shortage because it's so low paid. Not because it's not a good job, but because it's so low paid and it has no benefits and not value placed to it. So if we actually made these good paying jobs, I heard, as much as CEOs get paid because of the social capital that it builds in our community, just actually make them good jobs, then this could be something that, workers from dirty industries could shift to being caregivers and doing something really productive. But also if they made enough, they themselves could actually then have flexibility to act more environmentally. When you're very poor, you have very little choice of the types of products and foods that you can buy, right? But when you actually have more income, you have that flexibility and you have that ability then to be that kind of environmental actor. And I just have to give a shout out real quick too, because some of this is happening on the ground in terms of creating accessibility. We have across the river, New York Care Majority is here, and which is one way, so creating economy that is care-friendly, feminist, and by creating universal care, health care, including long-term care benefits. So if you're not already active with them, you should also join them. Get a flyer today.
Thank you. It's striking, I think, that there's been so much discussion around the need to protect the salary levels, benefit levels of people working in the extractive sectors as they move to green jobs. And that is important, and this is a core principle of climate justice, but we aren't talking about how we make already low carbon jobs better jobs. And that needs to be a really central piece of a Green New Deal and a just transition. Dara, I would love for you to just lay out, you talked about those multiple vulnerabilities before, during, after disasters. Under a true Green New Deal that centered the disabled community, how would that change? What would it look like? Paint us a picture of that.
Sure. So I'm going to say the words that haven't been said in the groups that haven't been mentioned. So we see it as collective liberation. That if you uplift, collective liberation. So universal care was discussed here. Universal, when you talk about anything universal in our world, universal education, universal, it's for everyone. And so collective liberation, or even revolutionary liberation, I'm going to say something here. Many people, and I think the Green New Deal does this, many people want to move, they're playing chess, first of all, the game of chess, as if it's checkers. Let's stop that. So number one, when people play chess, they think the king is important. You are not men. It is the women. Women, it is the queen who runs that chessboard, and it is the women who will run this Green New Deal and moving us forward to a new life. Let me be very clear. And it is usually black and brown queens, so let me say that. So they also want to just move these chess pieces. They like these systems, they just don't like where they are in the systems, which also is not going to work, especially when it comes to white privilege. That is what is holding us up. You cannot keep your privilege and also move the pieces on the chessboard. Let's just be real here. We need to wipe that chessboard clear, turn it over, and start some new systems. And when you start those new systems, that means you start new policies and new systems. You must have the people who are directly impacted sitting at those tables making those changes. So disabled folks, and then I'm going to use another word that has not been used here, but we all know, Kimberly Crenshaw, and intersectionality. That the people are all things, and the groups who aren't mentioned here, right, immigrants, refugees, our incarcerated community and formerly incarcerated. Those institutions also include prisons. And if you saw what they did, they, in South Carolina, both hurricane seasons, 2017, 2018, and 2019, the governor of South Carolina told the cities to evacuate except for the prisons. Except for the prisons. So those inmates were in there. And then there are caregivers who work in the prison system, right? There are nurses and clinicians who had to stay. And there are prison guards who had to stay. They're caregivers. They're taking care of those people. Nobody's thinking about that. So we have to include all of these things as it is. And as was said before, when you change systems, you don't just change one thing. So it has to include all of these things. And I am still quite perturbed that healthcare wouldn't be the center of what you're doing. When in the civil rights movement, right, we all know that transportation, it's the chicken before the egg. Transportation, education, healthcare were like the top three things that people were fighting for, and we continue to fight for. So I think that we must include all voices at those tables, and I think people forget that disabled folks are educated, and they are architects and engineers and teachers and nurses, and that they have voices and brains, and they can also be very productive in making us move forward to this new system.
Thank you, Dara. Nella, would you talk a little bit about how you see the healthcare field in general, which is a huge field here in New Brunswick? How would it be transformed? I mean, this is, we've talked about how caring for people is already low carbon, but we know that, there's a lot of waste produced in healthcare. It's a big energy user. How could we actually seriously green this sector? Is it possible?
So first of all, I see healthcare in the future. There will be healthcare for everyone. Healthcare for all will be there, I hope, and I pray. Everyone should have access to healthcare. No one is exempt because healthcare is a human right. So no one is exempt. So as our role as nurses, we have to do more on preventive rather than taking care of patients that are already sick. So we have to work on keeping our patients healthier rather than them being sick. So a lot of preventive works. Nurses will also be educators. First, we educate ourselves, our members, our community, our family, our patients. We are really good educators. We tell our patients, take this medication twice a day, okay? And they really listen, because if they don't, probably they will be like having side effects or they die. So we use that part of us and to really convince people to be more mindful. And so number one would be educating the public, and number two is energy conservation. We have to be firsthand in the hospitals to learn how to conserve energy, to be energy efficient, and lights should automatically shut off, which is actually happening right now. Also to conserve water, because hospitals actually are the highest facility that use water. They use 700,000 gallons of water per patient a year. So that's really actually a lot. So we have to conserve water so that we will have more water to use. And then food service should also be sustainable. We should be there, I should act as a role model to our patients to eat healthy food and use locally produced food that are, again, sustainable. And of course, green building design. We're actually teaching our members right now on what greening means, and actually they could actually disseminate this information to our patients upon discharge. And for example, recycling waste, one of them is recycling their own medications that are not being used. So properly dispose of medications, not just throw it in the bathroom or the kitchen sink. They have to be returned back to the pharmacy, because otherwise it will be incorporated with the water that we drink. Also the waste disposal. Slowly we have to teach our patients to recycle, of course, which is actually what's going on right now. Compost and use, again, food that are sustainable, from the local produce and from the gardens right around your neighborhood.
I mean, this points to the fact that hospitals and schools and universities are anchor institutions in our communities, right? We're major consumers, right? So if we changed the kind of food that was being served in schools and hospitals, it would change agriculture, in the area. If we changed how we're getting our energy, and we've had some progress made here at Rutgers in terms of more aggressive targets. Maybe we'll hear more about that during the Q&A. But I mean, it can be, if we just decided every school, every hospital is going to, have solar panels on the roof, and it's going to, or a solar array outside, because I think it takes more than rooftop solar to power a hospital. It would be a game changer in terms of energy, because it's in every community, right? So I want to ask why you think you haven't been included more in the conversations around the Green New Deal, if there are any theories, and also what it sort of feels like to be in this conversation with other across different care sectors.
For me?
Anyone who wants to tackle the question of why these sectors haven't had a more central part of this debate so far.
For disabilities, I think no matter what issue area you talk about, disabilities is the last group to be even asked, or even they don't ask. That's why we step forward and say, hell no, you're not going to do this without us. And I'm not a person with a disability, but I've been in this community for 10 years, so I can just say that. And it's disappointing that it's not just disabled, for LGBTQ, right? The communities are they're not engaged. And then the power structure of, unfortunately, you started the conversation, Naomi, about the Hill and about a resolution. People had to take over Nancy Pelosi's office for them to be heard. Nancy Pelosi, who is considered, right, a progressive, I don't know, I use air quotes. That is disappointing, right, for us to have to take over people's offices. And I also think that people look down on taking over, right? Adapters are told all the time, you just don't know how to get this done. That's not how you do this. Well, I don't think President President Johnson one day woke up and said, oh, let's pass the civil rights movement. He was disrupted, and that is what happens. And so I think, for our community, we get left out of the conversation because we're not thought of as productive. Disabled folks aren't thought of as productive, and that's why. And it's a shame that there is a hierarchy in social justice. That's what I was saying about collective liberation. That hierarchy in social justice movement, that is not social equity. In social equity, we are all the same. We all need the same things to be changed and to help our lives out. And until that happens, none of these groups will be left, all the groups will be left out. And we have to start saying collective liberation. If I'm moving forward and you're not moving forward, then none of us. That's community. And that's what we have to start doing.
I think Emily and Aki both want in.
Okay. Yeah, I think these are female, largely female jobs that aren't profit driven, right? I think that's a huge part of it. They're people centered, they're the employees, the workers are women. I think that you can't understate that, or you can't overstate that. I think that contributes in large part to this work not being seen as work. We're not producing goods to be sold for a profit, and we're women, so it's just not real work. So it's not seen as a real jobs solution to the climate crisis.
Similarly, like domestic work is often not seen as work, even though it's the work that makes all other work possible. So because it's women's work, and it's just something that women naturally do, it's not seen as work. So, because it's been so undervalued, care work, it hasn't even been looked at as a viable option, even though it's this huge need that we have in the community, in this country, hasn't seen as like, this is an opportunity for jobs, right? But it hasn't been looked at that way because it's been so undervalued, as women's work. And as you said, domestic workers were excluded from the original New Deal, farm workers and domestic workers. And it wasn't just for any reason, it was because of the South, right? They wanted to exclude all African Americans from the New Deal. And so it was because of racism and because of economic greed that they wanted to keep the hierarchies in the South, that they said, well, if we can't exclude all African Americans, we'll do the next best thing. They're mostly working as domestic workers and farm workers, and that's how the exclusions came about. So those forces are still working in our society today. And so I think, like you said, we need to make sure that as we create the New Deal, the Green New Deal, we have to lift up those things like front and center and make sure that what we're addressing is also those things, because like you said, climate change exacerbates existing conditions, right? And so if we don't put that front and center, then our solutions are just going to make those things worse unless we center it as part of the solutions.
Thank you so much. Emily, I have a couple follow-ups for you before we open it up to Q&A. You mentioned briefly that you were calling for a tax on fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share. And I think I'd love to hear you talk more about that, because when we talk about climate justice, we often talk about justice meaning the people who have been most excluded, who have been on the front lines of the extractive industries, need to benefit from the transition. And that is justice, and it's also not leaving workers behind as their industries change, and that is justice. But there's another piece of it, and that is that the people most responsible for the crisis have to pay more of the share because it's their fault, right? That was a key part of your strike, and I'd love for you to talk more about the lessons from that.
Yeah, I think, and again, this gas severance tax demand didn't come from sort of like a climate point of view, right? But you had these teachers and cooks and bus drivers, because of course this school service personnel were part of this strike as well, who all of a sudden were making this point that the basically our state was in this mess, this budget mess, because of handouts to the fossil fuel industry. And that message really caught on. And that was something I never expected. This is, West Virginia is a state where coal industry propaganda is, taught in our schools, right? It's pervasive. And so I just, to see the entire Capitol filled with workers chanting "tax our gas," on like the second day of the strike, it was massive. That was huge. Yeah.
Well, I want you to talk a little bit more about that mobilization, because when we evoke the historical memory of the original New Deal, like Dara said, nothing comes from on high out of the goodness of the heart of power. It is always because people are demanding it from below. And throughout the years of the New Deal, you had historic levels of union mobilization and strikes, more strikes every year, demanding more from the New Deal. 30, 35, 36, 37. I don't know if Janice Fine left, but she would be nodding if she were here. I think she had to go teach her organizing class to train future strikers. But we just had the climate strike, 7 million people participating. Of course, that was supported by the Rutgers Union. What do you think that the Green New Deal movement, demanding this, because we don't have it yet, needs to learn from the history of labor unions?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that, our Capitol was filled with thousands of teachers and school service personnel. And that was a beautiful sight. But that's not why we won our strike. We won our strike because we shut down schools for 9 days straight. And we said, we're walking out and we're not going to go back until you meet our demands. And so I think what we can learn from the New Deal and what we can learn from our strike in West Virginia is that all out, full participation strikes, with no end date, get the goods.
All right.
Yeah.
It's an important lesson, folks. All right, we have some time for questions, and we have a microphone. Are we going to do a roving mic?
Yeah.
Ooh, Avi used to host a talk show and run around with a roving mic. So. All right.
Hello, testing. Thank you. It was wonderful. All the information that everyone gave and shared was just very enlightening for me. One question I did have. My name is Mary Elizabeth. I'm from Princeton, so little drive. Sorry I was late. But one of the questions that I have is regarding Katrina, which I think for many people was the first time people realized that we had a serious problem in the country. And I was shocked in the way that the Bush administration rejected all aid worldwide. And we all knew it was an ego thing. We all knew that a lot of it had to do with race. And I just want to know from that experience, people in your profession, have they collaborated internationally with regard to the issues that we're having in small ways, not in Red Cross ways, but in small ways because our government kind of failed us in that regard. So I wanted to know what the professional community did as a whole in each of your sectors might have did to, and is doing for that to, not happen again.
I want to put Nella on the spot because that's your wheelhouse, and then anybody else who wants to chime in.
So for the meantime, we have the New York Relief Network, in which we work with other health workers, like I said, but nothing really to collaborate with the whole of the USA. I don't think we collaborate with the nurses in California, the RNRN network, as well as the New York NNU nurses. Yes, so yeah, we collaborate with them. But as far as we just. Exactly, yeah. I'm hoping that it will be part of the Green New Deal. Yeah, because for right now, we're just working on our own network. But I think the response is more faster this time, that we see all this disaster happening and we just don't wait, we just go. We don't wait for anybody to tell us, we just go.
I'll just say this, the answer is no, unfortunately, and I'll say 9/11, 2001 for us, right, the tri-state area in DC, I think is where it really started for especially disabled folks. I wasn't in disabilities then, and I had to leave some people, right, because they couldn't get out of the train station, and I don't know where they are to this day. But anyway, deaf people did not know what was going on. Then 2005 was kind of Katrina, and I'm going to say this, it usually, fortunately, starts from the government and goes down. So even within FEMA, which is our federal emergency management, so there wasn't an Office of Disability Rights until 2009. Okay, so that's still going on. In our community, we do have Port Light Strategies, which has been around since 1997, and trying to do that, trying to collaborate. We have what's called the Get It Right conference. It's done every 2 years. You'll see some conversations around there. But it's unfortunate, like most things in government and in this work, people work in silos. And I will have to say it hasn't been until this conversation around the Green New Deal and what that means to different communities is when it kind of got started. Like even the nurses, like she just said, the nurses across the country. You might have Doctors Without Borders. You have that kind. I don't see that in our work in emergency. I have never seen a conversation around that. So we're getting new ideas. Let's write that down. Like yes, and you are correct. It is across the world.
I'm going to add on to that. I'm happy to say, though, that as part of our contracts as nurses, we put it in that nurses should be excused in work if they are willing to volunteer, no matter what. And this is really a progress on our part, because before we would wait for us to be given a day off, and this time we're actually given a day off in times of calamity. So this is good in our part. So we could just go and leave.
And just while you're getting the next one, so you know, they're getting rid of the Office of Disability Rights, right, in FEMA right now, so.
All right, yeah, question back there.
This is sort of about your last question about how teachers won in West Virginia. I'm wondering, it's a kind of two-part question. One, how we can activate unions to put stuff about the Green New Deal in their collective bargaining agreements, and also strike for the Green New Deal if necessary, and then also how we can activate non-union workers who are maybe not in organizations at all to have some kind of confrontation with capital to actually make this happen, because obviously like the protests and the sit-ins are really good and important, but I think, you know, what we've seen with the teachers and other striking workers, it's like we really need to throw a wrench in what the rich are doing and in their profit gathering. So I'm wondering how we can do that for the environment.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that, you know, the global climate strike, you know, these massive protests is a huge thing. And it's super inspiring. I've been was brought to tears watching these videos. And I know, I can't imagine what that's just doing all across the globe, right? I think as far as, we need to get to the point, you're right, that we're organizing entire workplaces, entire companies, entire school districts, to walk out with a list of climate demands. But we need to come up with the climate demands, and that's the thing. So we need to get the Green New Deal to a point where teachers and workers are willing to say, yes, this is for me. This is for me, and I'm willing to go on strike over this. Yeah, as far as the specifics, we need to talk about the specifics.
Aki, did you want to talk about people who are outside of unions?
Yeah. Well, definitely has to go beyond unions because we don't have as big of a union density today. But I think it is still recognizing the power of workers when they're organized, right? To really throw a wrench in things. With domestic workers, it becomes very challenging because if you're the only person taking care of another person, it's very difficult in terms of thinking of a strike, right? Mm-hmm. But if we do think of something that brings together across industries, something that's also a more general strike, where we can bring workers together in solidarity to do a collective action that really could bring society to a halt until these demands are met. That we have to think in real terms of power. What actually will make a difference? But that's why we have to support organizing efforts, especially of workers across the board. And some will be in unions, some will be in other formations, but there's a way to actually, if you build the strength of workers and workers' organizations, then you're going to build a strong muscle to be able to actually leverage power when we are moving on the Green Deal. And I think it's important that we're including actually all of these different jobs in the Green New Deal explicitly so that people know that this is for them and it's not just about solar panels versus coal, right? That this is actually about transforming our overall economy and what's at stake for all of us.
One thing I would just quickly add is that the student climate strike movement is it's really at its very early stages here in North America and everywhere. I mean, it really just started a little bit more than a year ago. It started in August of last year. But in Europe, it's a much more serious strike movement in the sense that, what kids in school, the only labor that they can withhold is their educational labor. And so far in North America, the strikes have been a major kind of one-off, right? And that is not the case. In Italy, every Friday, there are tens of thousands of students who are out of school. And it is kind of flummoxing their parents and teachers and political leaders, and they're doing it Friday after Friday. It is not like a one-off protest. So it's more on the model of a traditional strike, because to arbitrarily just say we are going to have a 4-day school week it's an exercising of power by students, right? And here I think there's been a lot of sort of patting the students on the head, yay, go on strike, it's a one-off, right? It's more like going to a protest, but that's not the way it's playing out in certain European countries.
Hi, I'm Belinda Davis from Rutgers. These last two comments, I think, really feed into my question. I'm really grateful to hear about this range of forms of activism and the connection of all the issues, these issues, how they all tie together, which I believe I share as bedrock to this issue. I'm wondering, in terms of the introductory comments, I say this not as a member of the Green Party of the US, although I am, but as an historian of social movements and primarily in Europe. The Green New Deal in the trajectory that you were talking about, of course, was the platform of the 2016 Green Party candidate, and that was part of precisely attaching together environmental and so many other issues, health care for all, anti-environmental racism, yada, yada. And I'm curious if there's a reason, because I think it's also the case maybe in On Fire, that there was kind of a strategic decision not to make reference to it in talking precisely about this trajectory and its politicization, including in On Through, the Sunrise Movement, which I absolutely love and work with, although I'm too old. I'm just wondering, it seems to me really important to recuperate that piece of the politicization of the issue in light of the effort of the two-party corporate system to crush any form of politics outside that realm. Does it seem too is it too inconvenient? I'm curious about the reasons for that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very, very quick and dirty history. There are lots of people who didn't get name checked in it. But it's certainly fair and true that in a more extensive history of how we arrived at this moment, that it is true that Green parties around the world actually have been talking about a Green New Deal. And it isn't their idea. It comes from the climate justice movement. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm John Shu. This question's for Emily. Emily, I was just wondering, what's the appetite in West Virginia for a Green New Deal? And is it possible for someone like Paul Jean Swearengin to get elected to the Senate? She's a very strong supporter of the Green New Deal and Medicare for All.
Yeah, I would say the appetite is pretty low right now, but we're working on it. That's why I'm here. It's, again, the fossil fuel industry is everywhere in West Virginia, but, we're starting to see cracks. And I think that in any organizing, we have to find those cracks and we have to deepen them, right? And as far as Paula, I think she got like 30-some% of the vote against Manchin, which in the last time that she ran, which a candidate like Joe Manchin, I think a lot of us were, I don't know. I totally support Paula, and I hope that she wins. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Deborah Lancaster, and I'm the director of the Center for Women in Work here at Rutgers. And I just wanted to thank all of you for, and Naomi for this panel, which has been incredible. And I think, I'll try and make this very brief, but one of my great frustrations in my career has been going to panel after panel where we think about how do we want to add more skills to frontline care workers? How do we upskill home health aides? And, we really, I guess I'm wondering, because I don't think those strategies work, but this one's giving me a little bit of hope about framing this around green jobs, the future, what is our future economy going to look like, and how can we start? And I guess my question is, here we are, we're at a university, and I know that organizing is a great part of this, but in changing hearts and minds. But what can the university do? So one of the currencies we trade in here is research and teaching. What's missing? What advice do you have for those of us who are on the front lines of research, if I can even be so obnoxious just to say that's front lines, because it's not heroic work at all, although there are heroes out there. But what is it that is missing? How can that labor partner with all of you in your efforts? What advice do you have for those of us who do dabble in research? And what are the other ways, as I think Naomi mentioned, we're an anchor institution, and besides getting rid of water bottles and some of the other things we could do here on campus, how can we position ourselves to be better partners in this effort, particularly around research?
Well, even documenting these ideas and creating, frameworks around them, helping to get them, push them out there so that more people can actually engage with them, right? So we're live streaming here, but I don't know how many people are actually on the live stream, right? But how do we actually start to popularize and get more of this intersectional and thinking, broader, or out to more people? And so those things actually can be tools as we're working with home care workers themselves to really understand and place themselves within the Green New Deal and to be able to make those connections. We actually did not think about caregiving and home care jobs as within the Green New Deal framework until we started talking about it with Naomi. It's like, yes, and there's so many connections. So, so having institutions that can help us to really solidify those ideas and help us to popularize them, that would be helpful.
And I'm the policy person, so I'm going to say this. Try to infuse civics education to our students so they understand and know that they have the right to talk to their elected officials. I know, right, your university, so sometimes, it's, are you lobbying? No, that's educating. And actually, I know people, I know this all the time, but we need to have interns. We need to have young people who are actually doing this work and getting paid for those internships, especially students of color and multi-marginalized students, right, who can't afford to work down in Trenton or work down in DC or have a conversation. And also push forward the importance of elections and voting. Every one of your students should be registered to vote. Now, how you do that in class is your business. I know, again, you're crossing lines there, but I'm so sorry. That is imperative. You should not be a Rutgers student if you have the right to vote in this. So we have a lot of international students, I understand that, and not be registered to vote. And I'm a North Campus person, and so our teachers did, I was a poli-sci, BA poli-sci, we did this. We talked about it is imperative for you to vote, it is imperative for you to listen to what's going on around the elections, around not just national, but your local elections, your state elections. And so I think that has a lot to do with how moving this forward as a policy, right, agenda, and making sure that our young people are just as knowledgeable in the area which they wish to learn in, which I think is wonderful, whatever you're studying. But at the same time, you do have a civic responsibility to be a person who is active in policy and politics, regardless if it's proactive or reactive or just sitting on the sideline and watching, but we can't do it without them. And you have that knowledge, and I do believe in research to policy.
Hello, my name is Thomas Jones. I'm a Rutgers student currently, and my question is, how do we break the cycle of suspicion in our neighborhoods when we think of home health aides and building a community of being knowledgeable about the people on our block, the people in our neighborhood? How do we bring back the 90s, where we knew that Mrs. Smith lived across the street or Mr. Pender lived right next door, and that we would help him, maybe he has heart problems and we know to look out for those things? How do we build up the bond between our neighbors again? Because now everybody's so suspicious of their neighbors that we don't even know their names. How do we break that cycle to move forward?
It's a great question.
First of all, I want to say thank you for your question. And if we had the answer to that, none of us would be sitting here. But honestly, that goes, like we were just talking about, this touches everything, right? That goes into criminalization, right? And in neighborhoods, in law enforcement, and how that plays out in your neighborhood. I'm just going to say a practical one, and I'm from like Newark, New Jersey, East Orange, block parties. I mean, people don't get together anymore and talk to each other. My aunt has a driveway. She drives down in and goes in the garage. And when I went to visit her, neighbor's like, could you tell your aunt such and such and such? Because she never talk, like they don't talk to each other. So it's, of course, the neighborhood in there. But then also, again, back in policies, you can't keep creating things that criminalize people. Right? Like if you're speeding too much and they give you a ticket now, they want to, right? You get 5 tickets, then you have to go to court. We keep criminalizing each other. I think it also starts in the schools. Right, Emily, when we teach our children, we have to teach our children love and compassion and care. But that's a big question. I applaud you for asking it. I think we got a lot of work to do, but it definitely deals around criminalization. I do think the Green New Deal can help, and that's infrastructure, right? You can't keep creating laws that criminalize people, because then that creates suspicion about people. So I'll just say that. I'm sorry.
I can do, yeah.
No, I totally agree with that. And then just, I think there's also an opportunity with the threat of disasters and this crisis to actually be a good reason for connecting, right? That people could spearhead and actually create, go door to door and talk to people and call meetings together, But I think there just has to be kind of that call to try to start. There could also be in different neighborhoods where there are different institutions, religious institutions, or other institutions also could, that the Green New Deal could also be calling out, for neighborhoods to do this locally. I know there are some synagogues that create programs where they provide welcome gifts and they do door-to-door visits and things like that. There's actually a lot of different models that actually exist in this community, in this country, and other countries too. But we do have to have some leadership to start doing it, right? So in each neighborhood, there has to be someone who starts trying to break that suspicion and start helping people to actually know who each other is. It's also hard when we're in this capitalist society that makes us move so much too, one that makes us work like around the clock as well as like have to move around for jobs. I don't know what the solution for that is. That is just a new situation that we're in. But if we can start and, if we can build the impetus for people to start to take on this role and create clear models of reaching out, then maybe we can do it.
Well, I love that people want to stay all night and talk about care work as climate work. It is 7 o'clock, and we promised that we would wrap at 7. So I'm really sorry. If you want to email the questions you didn't get to ask to GS Chair, I will share those questions with GS Chair at Rutgers. I'll share them with our wonderful panelists. It's important to remember, just related to that last question, that we also see incredible acts of solidarity in the midst of disasters, and we see that kind of community. Think about what happened after Sandy, and Occupy Sandy going out. Thousands of volunteers going into neighborhoods. We also saw it in California after the fires. I mean, people wanted to do everything they could to help open their homes to strangers. And I guess what the real message is, we actually need to do it before disasters. We need to get to know each other so that people don't get left behind. And in response to Deb Lancaster's question about research, I got to see some really beautiful engaged scholarship while I was at Chico State just last week, because so many scholars, and it was striking that they was almost all women who came to this meeting, about 9 researchers who are trying to map the social fallout from the Camp Fire, from this largest fire in California's history. And they're looking at everything from like where people have moved to, who have been displaced, what the multiple vulnerabilities were. But one of the most striking things that they shared is that we know that 86 people died in that fire, and we know one of the only things we know is that most of them were elderly. When you look at the list, it's people many of them are in their 80s. We do know that many people were disabled because many of the people who were found in homes had ramps that were up. They weren't able to lower the ramps on their own. But they said something really interesting to me, which is that nobody who was in any kind of collective care, whether it was a nursing home or a hospital or a school, nobody who was in collective care who was in the hands of care workers died. It was only people who were isolated and who were alone, right? And so we are entering this era we are in this era of climate disruption. And these disasters are lethal. But what really kills is isolation. It is a culture that abandons people and turns people against each other. And what saves life is the labor of care, unpaid and paid. So I just want to really thank this incredible panel of amazing frontline women organizers and workers. You've taught us so much. It's been such a privilege to be in conversation with you, and I hope that this is the beginning of a much deeper engagement between your sectors and between all of your sectors and this broader discussion about what it means to rise to the crisis of climate change and build a better world. Thank you so much.